The cook had been serving chow for 11 hours, and his feet had stopped being feet somewhere around hour 8. And when the colonel's mess kit came across the serving line, ahead of the line of enlisted men still waiting, the cook did something that every instinct of self-preservation in his body told him not to do. He held the ladle still, and he did not fill it. The line went quiet, the way a line goes quiet when something is happening that should not be happening. Because you did not do this. You did not decline to serve a colonel, a cook, a private, a man whose entire place in the order of things was to put food on the tray of whoever held the tray out, did not look at a regimental commander and decline. It was very close to unthinkable. But the cook had a reason, and the reason was that there were still enlisted men in that line who had not eaten. Men who had come off the perimeter or off the road, and the cook had it fixed in his mind, from somewhere, that the men ate first. And the colonel had come across the line ahead of them, whether by accident or habit, or simply because a colonel is used to the world arranging itself around him, and the cook, exhausted past the point of good judgment, or perhaps arrived at a kind of judgment past exhaustion, would not fill the tray. He said it, more or less. He said the men had not all eaten yet. He said it to Colonel Lewis Puller, with a ladle in his hand and 11 hours on his feet, and no idea what was about to happen to him. And what Puller did in the next few seconds made the whole mess line go silent a second time, and the men who saw it told it for years, because it was the opposite of what a colonel put in his place is supposed to do, and it told them something about the man they were following that no order ever could. If you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Let me back up, because to understand why the cook did what he did, and why it landed the way it did, you have to understand a principle that runs through the Marine Corps like a spine, and what it actually costs to keep it. There is a tradition, old and deep, that in the Marine Corps the men eat first, the officers eat last. When there is a chow line, the junior enlisted men go through it first, and the officers, from the lieutenants up to whatever rank happens to be present, wait until their men have been fed, and then they eat what is left. It is a small thing, mechanically. It is a very large thing, symbolically, and the symbolism is the point, because it is a daily, visible, repeated demonstration of a principle that an army lives or dies by, that the officers exist for the men, and not the men for the officers. Every other institution in the world tends to arrange itself the other way. The important people go first. The senior person is served first, seated first, deferred to first. That is how human hierarchies almost always work. And the Marine Corps deliberately inverts it, at the chow line, every single day, precisely because the inversion says something that needs saying constantly or it will be forgotten. That in this outfit, rank is not a privilege you cash in, it is a responsibility you carry. And the first thing that responsibility means is that your men eat before you do. Now, here's the thing. A principle like that is easy to honor when it costs nothing. In a warm rear area, with plenty of food, an officer waiting a few extra minutes to eat is a gesture, a pleasant tradition, almost a courtesy. It does not test anyone. Chosin was where it got tested, because at Chosin there was not plenty of food. There was cold that made a hot meal a matter of survival and not comfort. There was exhaustion that made every man, officer and enlisted alike, desperate for anything warm. And there was the constant pressure of a situation in which a commander might reasonably tell himself that he, of all people, needed to eat and stay functional because so much depended on his decisions. At Chosin, the principle that the men eat first stopped being a costless courtesy and became a real sacrifice, a thing that actually took food from the mouth of a cold, exhausted, responsible man and gave it to someone else first. And that is exactly when a principle either proves it is real or proves it was only ever decoration. Here's what doesn't make it into the accounts. The cook was not enforcing a rule to be difficult, and he was not, in that moment, thinking clearly about rank or consequences at all. He had simply been standing at that line long enough, in that cold, watching those specific men come through it, that the principle had stopped being an abstraction to him and become a physical fact he could not violate. These men, right here, had not eaten. The tradition said they ate first. And in his exhausted state, the tradition was not a rule he was choosing to follow, it was simply true, the way gravity is true. And when the colonel's tray came across the line ahead of unfed men, the cook's hands would not do the thing that violated it, almost independent of his conscious choice. He was, without knowing it, holding the line on the thing that made the whole Marine Corps what it was. And he was about to find out whether the colonel believed in that thing as much as the cook, in his exhaustion, did. Stay with me, because what Puller did is the whole story, and it is the reason it was worth telling for the rest of those men's lives. He could have done the thing that rank entitles a man to do. He could have been annoyed, even mildly, and let the annoyance show, and the cook would have filled the tray instantly, and the moment would have passed, and everyone would have understood that the principle was real, right up until it inconvenienced a colonel. That is what happens to most principles. They are honored until the important person is hungry, and then they quietly bend, and everyone notices the bending even when no one says anything, and the principle is a little less real afterward for everyone. He did not do that. Puller looked at the cook, and he understood immediately what was happening. That this exhausted man with a ladle was in fact correct, was holding the exact line that Puller himself believed in and had spent 30 years living by. And Puller stepped back. He took his tray out of the line, and he stepped back, and he waited. The accounts agree on this shape, that the colonel removed himself and let the enlisted men go ahead, and stood there with his empty tray in the cold, like any other man who would eat when his men had eaten, and ate last, after the men were fed, the way the tradition said, and the way he had almost certainly always intended to, before habit carried his tray across the line too early. And that was what silenced the mess line the second time. Not a reprimand, not a colonel putting a cook in his place, a colonel being put in his place, correctly, by a principle larger than his rank, and accepting it, visibly, without anger, without making the cook pay for being right, stepping back and waiting his turn behind his own men. And this is where it gets complicated, because it would be easy to hear this as a nice story about a humble colonel and to miss what actually made it powerful. What made it powerful was that Puller was not humble in the soft sense. He was one of the most decorated, most senior, most formidable men in that entire theater, a colonel who gave hard orders and expected them obeyed and was not in any way a soft or self-effacing personality. This was not a man who did not care about his rank. This was a man who cared about it enormously, and who understood, precisely because he cared about what rank truly meant, that rank was the thing that put him at the back of the chow line, not the front. His stepping back was not the absence of pride. It was pride in the correct thing. He was proud to be the kind of officer his corps demanded, and the kind of officer his corps demanded ate last. The men saw all of that in the few seconds it took him to step back. They saw that the principle they had been told about, the men eat first, was not a line in a manual that evaporated when a real colonel was really hungry and a real cold. They saw it hold, under pressure, in the person of the most powerful man present, who submitted to it not because he was forced to, but because he believed in it more than he believed in his own comfort. And a man will follow an officer like that into places he will follow no one else, because he has seen, with his own eyes, that the officer's rank is genuinely a form of service and not a form of privilege, and that the officer will therefore spend himself for his men rather than spend his men for himself. See, what most people miss about this story is that they think it is about a small act of humility at a chow line. It is about the only thing that makes hierarchy tolerable and the thing that makes it worth following. Every man in that line lived inside a rigid hierarchy that could order him to his death. That is an enormous thing to submit to. And the question every enlisted man carries, consciously or not, is whether the hierarchy above him exists to use him or to serve him. Whether his officers see their rank as a privilege that entitles them or a responsibility that obligates them. And you cannot answer that question with words. Officers say the right words constantly. You can only answer it with the small visible moments where the principle costs something, where the officer could take the privilege and instead takes the responsibility, where a colonel who could eat first steps back and eats last. Those moments are the entire proof, and the men are always watching for them, and they are worth more than any speech about leadership ever given. And there is a reason this reaches far past a chow line at Chosin. Because everyone who has ever held any authority over anyone, a manager, a parent, a teacher, an officer of any kind, is constantly, whether they know it or not, answering the same question in the small moments. Is my position a privilege I cash in, or a responsibility I carry? Do I go first, or do I make sure everyone else is taken care of and go last? And the people under that authority are always watching, and they always know the answer, because the answer is written not in what the person in charge says, but in whether they take the last seat, the smallest portion, the hardest shift, whether they use their position to get served, or to serve. The leaders people would follow anywhere are almost always the ones who, when it costs them something, quietly step to the back of the line. The cook, the accounts say, was not punished. Of course he was not punished. He had done exactly the right thing, and the colonel knew it, and the colonel's stepping back was itself the acknowledgement that the cook had been right. If anything, the cook had done the colonel a service, had caught his tray before habit carried it past the principal, and Puller was not the kind of man to punish someone for holding him to the standard he held himself to. The men in that mess line were fed first, the way they were supposed to be, and the colonel ate last, the way he was supposed to, and the whole small scene took only a couple of minutes. But it did something that lasted, because the men had seen the thing that words cannot establish and only actions can, that the man leading them believed his rank was a debt he owed them and not a prize he had won, and that he would prove it in the small, cold moments as readily as in the large ones. He did not talk about it. It was nothing to him. It was simply what an officer did, but the men talked about it. The day a cook refused to serve Chesty Puller before the men, and Puller stepped back and waited his turn, and made the whole mess line understand, without a word, exactly what kind of officer they were following out of that valley. So, was the cook right to do it, to refuse a colonel, to hold the line on the men eat first principle even against the regimental commander? Some would say he overstepped, that an exhausted cook does not get to decide to correct a colonel in front of the whole mess line, that whatever the tradition says, the discipline of rank matters more than a point of etiquette about who eats when, and that the cook was lucky he served under a man who took it well, rather than one who did not. Others would say the cook was doing exactly his duty, that the men eat first principle is not etiquette but the living heart of what makes the Marine Corps work, that holding it even against a colonel was not insubordination but loyalty to the deepest rule of all, and that Puller's response proved the cook had read the situation more correctly than 100 more cautious men would have. Let us know where you land in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, make sure you subscribe.